gathered friends and family, we come together this day in this place made holy by grief and gladness and gratitude, to join in the ancient human sacrament of remembering and celebrating our departed. We gather as one community, bound together by loss and grief, to mourn and to honor the life of our beloved Donald Everett Crannell, in gratitude to be counted among those whose lives he touched. Death comes to us all and awakens us to the gift of life that is far more precious and far more fragile than we ordinarily assume. And to imbue such loss with meaning is to stay awake to the fact that it matters how we live and how we love, so that in our living and dying, we may know together a deeper purpose and measure of our lives. May we find a grace strong enough so that in our pain we may find comfort, in sorrow, hope, and in death, the courage of faith to lead us through the years until we see that the presence of all whom we have loved has been with us, illumining our journeys each step of the way. So now, as you are able, may we gather in spirit and voice. May we rise in body or in spirit and join in our opening hymn, Amazing Grace, number 205 in the gray hymnals. You remain standing and join in the responsive reading printed in the order of service. In the rising of the sun and its going down, we remember them. In the opening of buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the rustling of leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. May we be seated. Friends, we gather as one community, bound together by loss and grief, and to discover in our mourning that we are not alone. So some words on grief. Voices of wisdom advise us that we, the bereaved, are not alone. We belong to the largest company in all of the world, the company of those who have known love and sorrow. When it seems that our sorrow is too great to be borne, let us think of the great family of the heavy-hearted into which our grief has given us entrance. And inevitably, we will feel about us their arms, their sympathy, their understanding. So we are here to hold one another. We are here to sympathize, and we are here to try to understand. But our faith does not diminish death by attempting to explain it. The mystery and magnitude of death cannot and should not be explained away. Grief is something to be lived through. It asks us to embrace it. It asks us to honor it. For at its core, grief holds for us an unaccountable gift. So there are some things we should know about grief, beginning with this. There is no one right way to grieve. Each of us finds our own way. And yes, grief has its stages, but they are not so orderly as we may believe. We attempt to bargain, we get angry, we fall into denial or numbness. We may find ourselves reaching for the phone and then remember with shock that our loved one is gone from us. Grief ebbs and flows. Each of us must find our own way until in time we will come to some sense of peace. But let me assure you, grief does not go away. It is not something people get over. Instead, time teaches us to weave each loss into the fabric of our lives, the stories, the memories, the piece of that person's humanity that is our inheritance. And to know that to live in hearts we leave behind is not to die. We also need to know that when we lose someone we love, it brings back every other loss we have suffered. And yes, though each of us needs time to grieve alone, we also need to return to our circles of friends and family. Just as villagers of old have returned to the well at the center to draw water and sustenance, we too need to come together and discover that we are water for each other. And so we come to this moment together to remember the people we have loved, unafraid to grieve with our whole heart, to not stop loving them with our whole heart until their values, their spirit, their character, and the very best of who they were comes to live in our hearts. And when we do, they remain a living presence forever in our lives. Will you now join me in a moment of quiet and prayer? And source of radiance and grace, we come to this time of quiet prayer, knowing that the word prayer is born of the same root for the word precarious. And so that prayer is the language of those who know how precarious and how precious each breath, each embrace, and each promise is. That prayer is a language of people who have known both gladness and grief, laughter and confusion. People who know that love is not some perfect state of sheltered safety, but that love hazards opening the heart to all that is real and true of being human, to our triumphs as well as our doubts and struggles and our regrets. For love risks the difficult embrace, the messy truths, and the many forces that make up the full and complex dimensionality of a person's life. And so love opens the eyes of the heart as we remember the people whom we have loved. As we hold close the life of Dawn shared with us, we pray for strength for family and friends gathered here, and to entrust to you, Holy One, any regret for whatever more they might have been or done or said in their reach to be and to do better. As their love follows their heart's treasure, help them to trust that love they once have known is never lost, that the loved one taken from their sight lives forevermore in a sure and unbroken presence. And so may it be. Amen.
You who knew my father, he wanted to do everything. He wanted to learn everything. He wanted to gather as much knowledge as he possibly could. He wanted to do as many activities as he possibly could. The Old Sailor by A.A. Milne, I was left this very, very worn copy. It's a family copy, but one of the poems that's in it resonates with me, and it resonated with my father. So I'll read it to you. The Old Sailor. There once was an old sailor my grandfather knew, who had so many things which he wanted to do, that whenever he thought it was time to begin, he couldn't because of the state he was in. He was shipwrecked and lived on an island for weeks, and he wanted a hat, and he wanted some breeks. And he wanted some nets or a line and some hooks for the turtles and things which you read of in books. And thinking of this, he remembered a thing which he wanted for water, and that was a spring. And he thought that to talk to, he'd look for and keep, if he found it, a goat or some chickens and sheep. Then, because of the weather, he wanted a hut with a door to come in by, which opened and shut, with a jerk which was useful if snakes were about, and a very strong lock to keep savages out. He began on the fish hooks, and when he'd begun, he decided he couldn't because of the sun. So he knew what he ought to begin with, and that was to find or to make a large sun-stopping hat. He was making the hat with some leaves from a tree when he thought, I'm as hot as a body can be, and I've nothing to take for my terrible thirst, so I'll look for a spring, and I'll look for it first. Then he thought as he started, oh dear and oh dear, I'll be lonely tomorrow with nobody here. So he made in his notebook a couple of notes. I must first find some chickens. Goats. He had just seen a goat which he knew by the shape when he thought, but I must have a boat for escape. But a boat means a sail, which means needles and thread, so I'd better sit down and make needles instead. He began on a needle, but thought as he worked that if this was an island where savages lurked, sitting safe in his hut, he'd have nothing to fear, whereas now they might suddenly breathe in his ear. So he thought of his hut, and he thought of his boat, and his hats, and his breeks, and his chickens and goat, and the hooks for his food, and the spring for his thirst. But he never could think which he ought to do first. And so in the end, he did nothing at all, but basked on the shingle wrapped up in a shawl. And I think it was dreadful the way he behaved. He did nothing but basking until he was saved.
I'm getting so old and rickety that I almost grabbed the flame. When Rose called and asked if I would say a couple of things today, I was thinking about how eclectic Don was and how he was interested in a little bit of everything. And last night, our son Jeff called to talk about Don. Jeff lives in Wisconsin. And he and Chris were christened by Don on the same Sunday about umpty-dump years ago. I won't give away your age, Chris. And so we go way, way, way back, and Carolyn, my wife, and me, with Don and Rose, and our family and their family. And my son Jeff said, Don was cool, and said he was always interested, and he was interesting. And I thought about that for a moment, because I think of Don, and I just think of Don. I don't have any particular adjective that I put in front of him, but Jeff was right. Jeff said, our son Jeff bummed around the world for a couple of years after college in Asia and in Europe. And when he would come home and we'd see the Crannells, Don would ask him about his travels. And Jeff said he always asked good questions. He didn't just say, well, I bet you had a good time, or was it interesting? He would say, well, how did you make contact with the people in Thailand? What did you have any interaction with the people? And those conversations, of course, became, long within years later now, 50 years later, 40 years later, Jeff still remembers that. And that was the type of person Don was in many ways. Chris came in a while ago and asked if I remembered about when Don and we were at a park in North Minneapolis. There were about 4 couples from the church that had kids about the same age. And Danny was on the swing set, as I recall, and he fell off and banged his head. And we all went into panic mode. And so we got him into the back of our station wagon, and Don and I were taking him to Hennepin County General Hospital emergency room because we didn't know anything better to do, and there were no such things as cell phones. And on the way, there was a cop car stopped for a stoplight, and I pulled up by him and I rolled down the window and I said, could you take us to Hennepin General? We've got this youngster who's fallen and banged his head and we're kind of worried about him. And the cop looked at me kind of funny, and then he said, okay, and they drove us to General. And I was very familiar with General because I was a newspaper reporter and I was over there a lot when I was a police reporter. We'd go over there to see who was been hurt that day. And so we got there, and Danny turned out to be fine and there was no complications. But after it was all over, the cop chewed Don and I out. I call it our police caper. Our sin was that we had turned my station wagon into an ambulance, and folks aren't supposed to do that. And so I attribute to Don the fact that I got chewed out by the cops, although we did avoid jail. Another memory I have of him, and these are sort of seemingly trivial, but in our lives were important at the time. I call it the dirty shoe caper. We were trying to put together 3 churches in southeast Minneapolis, merge them because they were all in financial trouble and losing membership. And I was on the committee, and we were having strategy sessions and everything, trying to get this all accomplished. And some members of the church weren't very eager to do this. And we had an older group in the church, and then we had the young bucks that had just come in. We were all, most of us new to Minneapolis, not all, but most of us. And we were migrants from places like Tennessee. I hope you've seen the accent or observed the accent. I still have it after 60 years. And so we were having conversations about all this, and one of the members of the session, Don had gotten all us young bucks to join the session. We were all in our mid-20s, and they didn't want to merge the churches, and so they started, as churches are wont to do, to sort of complain about things. And the main thing they complained about was Don had dirty shoes. He would be preaching on Sunday, and you'd look down and you'd see his shoes were kind of scruffy. He and shoe polishing Kit weren't very good friends. And so I thought that sort of summed up Don, too, in many ways. And my son, Jeff, the one in Wisconsin, said last night that he remembered Don wearing the what we call bolo ties. And I think there's one of him in this picture here that he's got on a bolo tie. And Jeff sort of asked him about that because I wore a tie every day to work. And my dad was a clothier, so I had to dress up a little bit. And Jeff was sort of kidding Don about his bolo tie. And Don said, "Oh, that doesn't matter. That's not who I am. I'm not a bolo tie. I'm much more than that." And which was a bit of wisdom that I think we could all hang on to. The other thing I wanted to mention was talking politics with Don. He retired and he was living in Wisconsin. He had left the ministry. He and Rose were living in a house that was a circle. You chased your tail all around it all the time. And near Somerset. And he got involved in county politics, and I think he was the county chairman for the Democrats. He at least was a precinct chairman. And then I retired from the paper, and I got active in politics because I had covered a lot of politics, but now I could be active in them. And so we would sit and talk politics, local, national, international, so forth. And I remember Don more than once shaking his head and saying, "What's it all going to come to?" It seemed like there were problems every time we turned around that were involving us as Americans or Minnesotans or maybe Wisconsin immigrants. And so I would always be wise and say, "Well, we'll have to see how it works out. You know, we've had problems in the past." And then Don would almost always say, "Well, we really need to be able to talk to each other and work through our problems." And this included the heyday of the abortion issue when there were demonstrations in the streets over abortion. And I had covered a lot of that as a reporter out in the Dakotas and all over. It wasn't just in Minneapolis. And I thought about that. You know, we talked about all of the trials and tribulations and the pros and the cons and how people were feeling so intense about things. And yet, Don and I sort of lean this way too, always tried to remember that we'd fought all our lives, one way or another. We had a terrible Civil War, and I grew up in the South and had a sort of a version of that, and then came up here and heard a little bit different version of it. And now we're having still a third version of it coming on now in the body politic. And so we would have these discussions, and then Don would always say, almost like a benediction, "Well, you know, these are good folks, and we have to try to understand and everything." And he was a person, one of my favorite people in life is Abraham Lincoln. And I think he was one of the wisest men to ever walk the earth. But anyway, Lincoln said, "With malice toward none," in his Gettysburg Address. And that's the way Don was, with malice toward none in his politics and in his life. And I think we could use a bit more of that today, if y'all will let me be serious for half a moment. Actually, more than a bit more, we need a whole lot more of that today. And that's how I'd like to end my words today, that we and Don should follow Don's example with malice toward none. Thank you.
Well, I would like to show you that I'm more like my father than perhaps we should know. I have traditions. I'm going to try to get through this without blubbering too much. Dad was many things to many people. He had a very strong presence, a laugh that was unmistakable, an incredible vocabulary, a strong intellect, a sense of humor, and an insatiable curiosity. There's going to be some themes that come up here. He cared deeply about helping to make the world a better place and about social justice. He knew an awful lot about relationships among people that make up families and the trials and tribulations of relationships among couples. Two main points I hear over and over about my dad are his curiosity and his intellectual interest in everything, in addition to his laugh. He was truly driven to understand everything. He wanted to know how everything worked and how it all tied together. It all needed to make sense intellectually and to meld together into a cohesive whole. There wasn't a lot of small talk. His conversations were always pithy, and he wanted you to explain how you knew what you were telling him and how that all worked. Always lots of questions, and they were sincere. He really wanted to understand everything. Dad was always about doing right in the world. He would tell the story of doing sit-ins at segregated lunch counters in Toledo as a teenager in the mid-1940s, of his camaraderie with other kids and his youth group during high school, other socially conscious kids that were trying to make the world a better place. He was an incredible preacher when he was on. I remember being in awe at his ability to hold a room. He was a skilled practitioner of psychodrama and family counseling, and he was instrumental in creating the Alfred Adler Institute of Minnesota. He was also really good at helping groups work together and helping them combine. He helped some small churches in Minneapolis merge in the early 1960s to become Andrew Riverside Presbyterian. He was behind the merger of the Freeborn-Mauer County Mental Health Centers in the mid-1970s. He worked with a set of 3 Protestant churches in Queensland, Australia, Nambour, Bly Bly, and Yandina, as they were becoming part of the Uniting Church. My dad was also very complex. He could be a bit demanding and was certainly stubborn, at least to those of us in the family. My kids asked at a very young age, "Why is Grandpa gulpy?" I never really had a good answer for that. I've known my dad for 61 years. I've struggled to make sense of his complexities and how he shaped me. In many ways, I am a reflection of my dad. I look like him, I'm curious like him, I carry his intensity and quest to do right in the world, and apparently I have dirty shoes. I think my father also had a great unsettledness that drove who he was and how he carried himself. He had immense intellectual understandings of things, especially rational things, but was tortured by his limitations to live up to the idealized visions of how he should be. He continually strove to do right, but struggled mightily when he felt he fell short. My eldest brother, Danny, you want to wave to people? My eldest brother, Danny, had a terrible illness when he was a toddler. He had a case of the measles, one of the common childhood diseases of the 1950s, now all but eradicated by vaccines, if people would get them, that went horribly wrong and attacked and damaged his brain. Danny's illness was extremely important in shaping our entire family, especially my dad. My parents committed to helping Dan become a full person and to learn and grow and develop as much as possible. They did everything they could. They learned all there was to learn about his condition, researched where they could move to find the best schools, and what were the cognitive and developmental issues that needed to be understood, how to move through a culture that did not really know what to do with people with the unique characteristics that Dan embodied. In spite of all that research and the intellectual understanding they gained, my parents still struggled. All the knowing does not necessarily prepare one for the being. Parenting Danny proved to be quite challenging. Dan has many of the attributes of my dad: gregarious, highly verbal, hearty laugh, high focus on certain specific things, some would say perhaps a bit obsessive, and a big stubborn streak. I'm not sure my dad ever really felt successful in parenting Dan. I believe that this exemplifies my father's unsettledness. He tried so hard throughout his life to understand everything and to do the right thing, but could not always measure up to his own expectations. He focused on his strengths: intelligence, curiosity, ability to bring folks together to create a common solution, clarity in understanding personal and interpersonal issues in order to help people find solutions to their own issues and to feel good about themselves. But he was acutely aware of the dissonance between what he understood was the ideal and his sense of his ability to live up to that ideal. I believe this was especially poignant in his relationships with his children. Dad was good at asking what I was doing and was driven to understand the complexities involved in all that, but wasn't so good about just being with me. The need to understand drove his interactions. All in all, my dad was a wonderful man. He impacted a lot of people and actually did help the world, make the world a better place. I think that perhaps the most important lesson I can learn from my dad is the necessity of leaning into the dissonance between your ideal self and your real self. To accept yourself as you are, and to be patient and kind and accepting of those around you. I'm not sure he ever achieved that, but this is the lesson I take from him, what I will try to do. My dad struggled greatly with dementia at the end of his life. Losing his intellectual self was his greatest fear. That was his core strength. I hope to learn from his struggles and be more at peace with the whole of me. This is my dad's legacy. Go boldly into the world, strive to understand, do good things for the world and the people in it, be kind and patient with all, especially yourself. And perhaps most importantly, laugh with abandon. I miss my dad.
From Eric Etchen, a longtime friend of Jamie. Many memories of Dawn and Rose. Their multi-year adventure to Australia, their complete love of square dancing, and their very cool dome home in Wisconsin. I can say that I had fun shooting basketball with Dawn at his invitation in a halfway house that was a former church where Dawn, Rose, and I lived for a year. So one memory that I tell people is I played basketball with a minister on a court that used to be a church sanctuary. I fondly remember his infectious laugh, warm sense of humor, love of travel, natural curiosity, and deep love of learning.
Marissa Crannell Ash, Don's granddaughter. My memory of Grandpa is of playing the dictionary game sometimes after dinner when he was visiting. We would challenge each other with words, and the other person had to provide the correct definition. The first person who had to go get the dictionary lost. I really loved the game and would seek out words to try to stump him. I remember one time I got him with perendinate, which means to put off until the day after tomorrow. He really fostered my love of language and of learning.
Larry Brzezinski, colleague and friend from the Department of Human Services. I first met Don when he was running the mental health center in Albert Lea, Minnesota. I was impressed with his engaging personality, energy, compassion, and wit. Years later, our paths crossed again after he and Rose returned from Australia, where Don was the pastor of a local Presbyterian church. Eventually, I hired Don to work at the Minnesota Department of Human Services Division of Licensing. He was a good employee, but one never really supervised him. Not that he needed supervision. We stayed in touch, trying out different eateries around town, especially after I retired. I always enjoyed our luncheons, which included Rose, who added immeasurably to the conversations. I have literally hundreds of stories about Don. It was such a pleasure to have worked with him, and especially to be his friend. He was a true friend, selfless with his time. A kind, intelligent, amusing, at times a bit of a curmudgeon, but especially loving man who helped me deal with some challenging times in my life. I hope to see Don again on the other side of space and time, a place with no suffering, no crutches, no breathing tubes, joy and peace.
John Crannell Ash, grandson-in-law. One of my early memories of Grandpa and Marissa and I going square dancing with Grandma and Grandpa, I was surprised by how much fun it was.
Sherry Black and Doris Knutson, fellow square dancers, remember Don from dancing with him in the good old days and the nice guy he was. Carmen Fessenmeyer danced with Don and Rose at afternoon squares in Hopkins. She writes, "I was a new dancer, so Don hollered at me when I messed up. He helped me learn plus calls, and I enjoyed them so much."
And also from square dancers Pat and Dwayne Olson. Don and Rose were very good dancers and helpful when I started dancing. Don was always a gentleman and interested in what we'd been doing and where we had been. They were fun to be with and remain active in dance until the pandemic shut everything down.
Nancy Bishop, co-worker and square dancer. I had the honor of knowing Don in several facets of life. The first was through the Minnesota Department of Human Services, where Don's work in the licensing division earned him the title of Mr. Rule 29. Although he was not particularly fond of the title, it was accurate. He knew everything there was to know about Rule 29, which governs mental health centers and clinics, and I mean everything. Later in life, I ran into Don at a luncheon. He was sitting across from me, wearing his trademark bolo tie, and I thought about how much he looked like a square dancer. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. I was thinking about returning to square dancing, and there was Don. The rest, as they say, is history. It was always fun to see Don at a dance. Although retired, he enjoyed discussions about work and was perpetually curious about my work and what was happening. It was usually just a few moments before he would find something humorous, and that fabulous laugh of his would fill the air. But the best part was being near him on the dance floor. He brightened any square with his presence and brisk, lively step. A promenade with him always made me smile.
Rose Olmsted, co-worker of Rose. I worked with Rose and Don as a social worker in Freeborn County. Don and Rose were real treasures in our community. Their commitment to serving the underprivileged was so evident.
Kathy Sullivan, friend of Jamie. Don was the director of our county mental health agency, and I interviewed him for my high school newspaper in 1977. My friend and I mined Don's quotes and insights from my interview notes to write a whole feature page of articles on teens and mental health. Thanks to our knowledgeable and engaging source, we received numerous compliments and accolades for the stories. When Don caught up with me, he expressed approval, but then pleaded with great fervor and earnest, "But did you have to quote my colorful language?" Of course we did. We were teenagers delighted with his colorful sound bites. Don was smart, funny, insightful, a good mentor, and always interested in what we were doing with our lives. We will miss him.
Eileen Counselor, staff person at Presbyterian Homes. Blessings and prayers for your family as you grieve the loss of your father. He will be missed very much. I always loved making him smile. Thank you for entrusting him with us.
Diane Crannell, daughter-in-law. Don was not a perfunctory "how are you" kind of person when you saw him. We all do that. When we encounter people, we say, "How are you?" And they say, "Fine." It's polite social exchange, not meant to have any real dialogue. But not Don. As long as I've known him, when he would get together with the family, he would say, "What's new in your life?" And he actually wanted to know. He was opening up a dialogue. He was interested in knowing about what you were doing, how it was going, and any other details that might be fascinating. He was genuinely interested in knowing about the world and what people were doing, like his brain was trying to capture everything to satisfy his curious nature. I knew him to be a person that cared about the greater good in the world, and he was always kind to me over the years. I cannot think of a single time in the over 35 years I have known him that he was mean or disrespectful to me. He just let me be me. What I will miss most is his unforgettable laugh. It was loud and boisterous and genuine, and it made me laugh too.
Bonnie Reynolds, Rose's niece. My deepest sympathy and love for the Crannell family. Don was the kindest man I've encountered in my entire life. May he rest in peace, Uncle Don.
Frank Heyman, Don's nephew. Holding Don in our thoughts for a peaceful finale. Don has always been a blessed and special guy.
Ward Moberg, Don's son-in-law. For me, Don was one of the most inquisitive and unusually learned people I've ever met. Unusual, I say, because he caught references to things few people ever have. I still remember the day I fell in love with him. I muttered one line from the late folktale written with similar sounding words, "Lattle Rat Rotten Hut," or Little Red Riding Hood. And Don said something to me like, "Wait, you know that story?" I recited much of it as best I could, and he beamed. He will be deeply missed.
Nene Crannell, Don's grandchild. Grandpa Don was an inspiration and support to me from my birth until his death. He helped to cultivate my interest in the arts by bringing me to countless performances at Orchestra Hall, the Guthrie, and other places growing up. He always took a keen interest in what I was doing in my life and always knew what to ask, even when he began to decline. He was a warm and inquisitive person, and I will never forget his hearty laugh and glowing smile. I miss him.
John Foley, Don's friend. I met Don and Rose when we helped start the River Falls Unitarian Universalist congregation in western Wisconsin in 1988. From day one, we started talking and never stopped. Fortunately for me, they moved to the metro area in the late 1990s, as I did, and we continued our friendship until his death. I found Don endlessly engaging, interested in everything, possessing a completely outrageous sense of humor, and open to anyone. I felt he was always listening and always in the present. Sometimes I wished he wasn't quite so comfortable telling me exactly what he thought at that exact moment, but one can't pick and choose. I will say that I don't think I ever had a boring conversation with him. I've known a few great men, and he was one. He will be greatly missed.
Linda Fay, Unity Church member. Don's resting face was unconditional positive regard. I was fortunate enough to experience that caring listening at my first Unity Church coffee hour when he and Rose welcomed me. As special throughout the 12 years to one of our last ones, though I knew he was confused, he kept encouraging me to elaborate on the story I was telling. For us in the first few pews, front left, he was our regular welcome person. One of my favorite memories is of the care he gave Helena Courier and the special day she lit up when he put the enhanced hearing earphones on her. Thanks for being you, Don. I miss you.
Joseph Fox, significant other of Denise, who is Rose's niece. What a life, a man who truly lived a life worth living. You truly outdid yourself, and you are an inspiration to everyone who loved you. You were ornery in the best kind of way and had a way of reaching people near and far. I can hear your laughter and sense of feistiness even now. That laugh alone gets you into heaven as far as I'm concerned. You sat down with me on different occasions and discussed life, passions, meaning, counseling, and introduced me to your own personalized philosophy of life. You helped me wrestle with things in some dark and challenging times in my life. When you spoke, I listened each time you spoke, and there was always a mixture of humor sprinkled with wisdom. You always made me feel like it was okay for me to be, and that was enough. If you've left me with anything, it is the courage and conviction to be who I am, and a burning well of dreams to leave a mark on the world the way you did. I have many heroes, and you are certainly among them. Thank you for everything. God brought home one heck of a man, father, person, counselor, pastor, uncle, and one of the greatest souls to grace this life.
Jenny Vilwalk, family friend. Don was an exceptional individual. His great joy overflowed and enveloped all whenever he entered a room. His joy was contagious. He was a childhood friend of my father's, who was also a minister. When my husband and I married a year after my father's stroke, Don kindly offered to perform the bulk of the marriage service so that my father could officiate our vows in broken speech. I doubt that Dad would have been able to do this if his trusted friend had not been standing nearby. Don brought sunshine to that day for us, and I feel it colored the tone of my marriage from then on, for it has been a sunny marriage. The night my father died, Don and Rose visited him in the hospital. Don cheerfully bid my father goodbye, remembering all the good times, thanking him for being a friend, and reassuring him it was okay to take his leave. Love and Joy was still in the house. My guess is that they're swapping jokes again, waiting for the rest of us.
Denise McCullough, Rose's niece. My Uncle Don Crannell was the most selfless man I've ever met. He lived his life helping others in various roles. He made a difference in my life and hundreds of people. When I was 3 years of age, my parents divorced. Neither mom or dad were in a situation to be caring for children for various reasons. My Aunt Rose and Uncle Don offered to take on the added responsibility of raising myself and my 2 sisters in addition to their own 4 children. While it never came to fruition, the idea of having 7 children to nurture could only have come from Rose and Don. I think back as to how much different my life would have been had they raised me with the opportunities that I never experienced with my own guardians, like culture, religion, education, curiosity, and stability. I consider myself so fortunate that Don and Rose were always involved in my life. Graduations, birthdays, funerals, holidays, vacations, family reunions, marriages, divorces, separations, and any time I needed them. They were always there. 2 visits of support came when no one else was there for me. At the birth of my son, Eric, who was born to me as a single mother, and 20-some years later during my divorce. Life-changing events such as these leave you feeling helpless and hopeless. But after a visit from the Crannells, you realize life happens, you are loved and supported no matter what the challenges endured. Life knocked me down, and here they came reminding me of my strengths and my abilities, telling me I was beautiful, smart, and passionate, and encouraging me to live my life the way I want. Uncle Don was a man of God, a minister, and he never condemned or lectured about life decisions. Instead, he pointed out the positive, listened, supported, and redirected my anguish. Uncle Don's career as a social worker is a personal inspiration to me, as a healthcare worker turned social worker myself. Scholar, educator, counselor, minister, advocate. I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people he impacted by his career choices. It's hard to put into words how much Don and Rose inspired my boyfriend and me, and how grateful we are to have had so many opportunities to share life with them. I secretly wanted a marriage just like theirs, based on love, commonalities, and respect. They could, and frequently did, finish each other's sentences. 71 years is a long time to be a committed partner. I consider them my surrogate parents, and I'm going to miss my Uncle Don so much.
From Ohio to Italy, from Dinkytown to Albert Lea, from Minnesota to Queensland, Australia, to a geodesic dome outside Somerset, Wisconsin, and in their pop-up camper to all 50 capitals of the United States and even to Nagasaki, Japan, to take the American tradition of square dancing. Don and Rose have traveled the world, and through all their journeys, I wonder about the countless bridges they must have crossed. People think bridges are designed for travel, mere pieces of road stuck up on legs of iron or concrete. But the more that I listen to the stories of Don's life, the more I wondered about bridges as connections that hold everything together. Bridges as more than a way between places, but the connections that hold the world together. If bridges were to disappear, perhaps the whole world would fall apart like oranges quartered. What, after all, is a question, if not a bridge? A question that bridges and connects this side of life as we know it to that other side with answers that can expand understanding and progress toward various ends. A good question, really good question that Don knew how to put together. A really good question is like a bridge. Understanding the distance across the chasm, envisioning the engineering of that span, and respect for the height of the abyss that it seeks to bridge. It exists before us in brief suspension, and then it moves forward. That's a good question. It summons us awake to the unspoken mystery of life itself. It stimulates, refreshes, expands, and inspires the risk worth taking to bridge to the greater possibility of our lives yet waiting for us. We all know that Don had an exceptional curiosity and appetite for asking good questions. questions that were neither perfunctory nor mechanical, but questions that generated the very path of his life and the life of his loved ones. But you and I know that there are questions that ask for greater courage than usual. Questions that are ahead of their time. Questions that refuse to accept the social norms of a time when special needs children were sent away and outsourced and forgotten. Questions that brought Dawn and Rose to the very edge of their knowing and being, to the very limits of their capacity. A question that required the whole family to step onto a cantilever bridge with courage and trust and great love for Danny. To cantilever across many fears, whatever the consequences and however it would change the family, as it surely would in crossing over that bridge. There are questions that cantilever from the visible to the invisible, bridges born of necessity. It forever transforms the setting, hazards the lives of people who will cross over the swift-flowing river of adversity and uncertainty, and mistakes and miscalculations and second-guessing oneself are as real as cables and beams in the journey from aspiration to wisdom. One of the hardest things in life to learn is knowing which bridge to cross. And a cantilever bridge can be hazard enough in the best of circumstances. A cantilever stretches beyond the balancing fulcrum, fixed and anchored only at one end, and floating and hanging at the other. And the longer the stretch of that cantilever, the more costly, requiring load calculations on the anchoring end to secure the counterbalancing weight and the downward force required. That diving board is a great example. And while beautiful pikes and tucks and twists and cannonballs may draw our attention, there is actually vital, critical, unseen work happening on that anchoring end to support the weight, the risk, and the movement. Yes, Don was diving into ministry and counseling, founding his own private practice and founding the Adler Graduate School, and each step of the way with his beloved Rose, circling left to Alamand right and promenade home. But it was the unseen, the hidden work that I believe Don really held close to his heart, that he struggled to get right. The work of that downward force and the counterbalancing forces of caring for Danny, for his family, and for peace and justice in the world that he had inherited. That complex and relentless and demanding work of love that is never as easily engineered as physics and structural design, and yet anchors the movement of everything. The work of love that is and remains the quintessential cantilever of trust and hope and courage that never stops seeking connection. Don understood that his questions that cantilevered out to others was rooted in the weight of such love, of that downward force where we lean into thick intensity and commitment to one another. There is nothing simple or orderly or logical or easily definable about love, whatever the dictionary may say. For no one gets to practice such love without cantilevering out, way out over troubled waters, and insisting on the weight of those who love us to hold us, to embrace us, to keep us close as we would for them. That's what love does. As one who traveled the world, Don and you, Rose, surely understood that a bridge is humble enough to know that it's never about finishing the journey, but about reminding us that it's wonderfully unfinished. And to be brave enough to leap over the chasm into newer and newer directions. The more I listen to the stories of the family, the more I believe Don, by nature and spirit and cultivation, was engaged in things unseen, ideas yet to be spoken, inventions not yet made, drawn by stories not yet told, a justice in the world that will yet meet us in proportion as we learn to think and ask great questions. Don was among those who breathed the living promises and aspirations, revealing to the rest of us that we are human beings always in the journey of becoming new, inspiring us to move forward, to embrace our own lives fearlessly, and to shape our own becoming. Arthur Foote, a beloved former minister of Unity Church, once wrote, "Only a few things bear the mark of the eternal: the giving we have invested in others, the love we expressed in deeds, the work we did because we loved it, the truth we spoke and tried to follow, the justice we stood for despite the fear of consequences, the evil we turned to good, because we saw that none of us lives apart, but we are all members of one another." We were not meant to live forever. It is that very fact which makes this life sacred. What alone endures is a spirit with which a person has met their life. And this spirit does not die. It is central message of every religion in recorded history that I'm aware of, that what was truly good of Don cannot die, that the universe wastes nothing. We all have our mistakes, regrets, and challenges. They die with us, but the victories of character and of spirit and the unceasing work of love, anchored in the weight of love and cantilevering beyond our fears to connect ever more deeply, cannot die and remains forever. The cantilevering bridge waits for us, summons us as we chase after the spirit of dawn. May it be so. Amen. As we are able, may we rise and join in the concluding hymn, "We Shall Overcome." Jamie and Rose and the family invite you into the parish hall following the service so that stories and memories and a chance to connect and be together can be extended. As a precaution for those who are wishing, you are more than welcome to take refreshments and invite others into conversation and time outdoors in front of the church building as well. Receive now the good word, the benediction. May the peace that passes understanding lead us into what was true and good and beautiful in the life that Dawn embodied for us and for so many. That such peace and love may cast out all fear, so that we might be cantilever bridges to the promise that yet awaits in our journey, so that unto anyone for whom love is a stranger might find in you and all of us welcome friends. May it be so, and amen.